My name is Julie Matus. I'm the Director of Education here at the James Museum. We're excited to have such a great crowd, and I want to thank you for braving the weather, because I know that was no easy task, so thank you for being here. I'm here just to give a lot of thanks tonight, starting with our members. We are so fortunate to have such an engaged group of members, so thank you for being here, for always supporting what we do. Your presence makes what we do possible, and your support makes it possible. So thank you. If you are a first-time visitor, we welcome you, and we thank you for being here as well. And we hope that you will consider coming back again and again, and maybe even becoming a member. I also want to give a big thank you to Todd and Karen Wanek. They are our adult lecture series sponsor. Oops. Sorry. And so their generous support is making it possible for us to offer programs like we are doing tonight. Yes, thank you. I also want to say thank you to our partner organizations. This program is the first in a three-part series that we're offering in partnership with WEDU and the Boxer Diversity Initiative, which, if you don't know about them, they're an amazing nonprofit organization based in Sarasota. They support and put on initiatives designed to foster tolerance and understanding of all groups, no matter their race, religion, or gender identity. And the James Museum is very proud to partner with them on this series. Yes. So all three programs in our series are centered around the current special exhibition that we have upstairs. If you have not seen it, it's From Far East to West, the Chinese American Frontier. So if you have not had an opportunity to see it, we encourage you to do so. It's on display through January 28th. And we have a program guide that is out at the front desk, and if you don't get one in the mail, I hope you'll grab one to get more information about the other programs that we're offering during this exhibition. So now it's my pleasure to hand it over and welcome to the stage Dan Boxer, who is the founder and head of the Boxer Diversity Initiative.
Good evening. My name is Dan Boxer.
Can't hear you, Dan.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Sorry. My voice isn't long enough. Julie actually stole a little of my thunder telling us what we're about, which is sort of... Can you hear me now? Self-explanatory. About 11 months ago, we heard that the James Museum was putting on an exhibit From East to West, the Chinese American Frontier. And we're based in Sarasota, so we're not experts on St. Pete, but we realized that there was not a lot known about the Chinese and the Asian Pacific experience here in Southwest Florida. So we went to Julie, who was amazing, and with the cooperation of the James Museum, we were able to cooperate to put on a discussion series, which Julie just told you about. I was going to tell you, but Julie already did. We compared notes. That there are three programs. One is the 3rd of December, and the next is the 9th of January, and you'll get a lot of information between us and the James Museum. I would like to introduce my partner in crime, Judge Charles Williams, who will introduce Dr. Tchen. Judge Williams is the judge of the 12th Circuit Court of Sarasota, Manatee, and DeSoto counties. Graduated from Howard and the University of Florida. He's been awarded the NAACP Lifetime Achievement Award, the Edgar G.H. Price Humanitarian Award, and the McCaig Award in recognition of appreciation for his dedication in promoting the ideals of equity, justice, and professionalism. Judge Williams will introduce Dr. Tchen, and he's going to be very angry with me because he's a very humble human being. He doesn't like to be introduced, but here he is.
Thank you all. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, lecturer, and presenter, Dr. Jack Tchen. Dr. Tchen is a historian of Chinese American history and the inaugural Clement A. Price Chair in Public History and Humanities at Rutgers University. Dr. Tchen received his bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and his master's and doctorate degrees at New York University. He was the founding director of the Asian Pacific American Studies Program and Institute at New York University. Dr. Tchen was named the inaugural Clement A. Price Chair in Public History and Humanities at Rutgers University. Dr. Tchen has received numerous awards, including the Charles S. Frankel Prize from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Martin Luther King Humanitarian Award from New York University. Dr. Tchen was featured in the film Nine Man, a documentary film, and is frequently called upon as an expert on Chinatown and Asian American topics. Dr. Tchen served as the senior historian for a New York Historical Society exhibition on the impact of Chinese exclusion laws on the formation of the United States, and also senior advisor for the 2-hour American Experience PBS documentary, which you'll see brief excerpts from, on the Chinese Exclusion Act. His most recent book, Yellow Peril, an archive of anti-Asian fear, is a critical archival study of images, excerpts, and essays on the history and contemporary impact of paranoia and xenophobia. And finally, I'd like to quote from Lonnie Bunch, the historian and secretary of the Smithsonian Museums, who tells us, "There is no reason to fear a history that, while illuminating the dark corners of America's past, also displays values and expectations that are central to American identity, such as resiliency, family, education, and fairness." And no better person than present this story to you is Dr. Jack Tchen.
Well, good evening, everybody. Thanks for coming out. I mean, it's not the greatest weather, so I really appreciate this really strong turnout. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? No? Okay, I'll try to speak louder. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction to this documentary. This is a documentary film, really the first significant nationally shown documentary about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And I would say that probably most Americans have not known about it. I don't know how many people here knew about the Chinese Exclusion Act. Could you just raise your hand? Oh, wow. Okay, that's great. In part maybe because of this exhibit, I don't know. That's really great. But the film was also linked to an exhibit, really the first major exhibit at the New York Historical Society. So the two were interlinked, and I was a senior advisor for both the film and the exhibit. Now, I'm really standing here in front of you because there were many generations of Chinese American scholars. Many of them did not have PhDs. Many of them were, humble people working in restaurants and laundries who were really the people who we are building our stories around and on top of. So I just kind of want to acknowledge that this kind of history is not something academic. It's actually something that's lived, and we're all impacted by it in some way or another. And it's also related, intimately related to the stories of African Americans, indigenous American people. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that this exhibit is really well worth seeing. So I'm not sure how many of you had a chance to really spend some real time upstairs. And I just encourage you to. I was very deeply touched. And part of what you'll see is how a number of Chinese American artists were, of course, documenting the story of Chinese exclusion, because these stories have primarily been told by non-Chinese, either in photographs or in writing. You know, you have lots of Western writers writing about the heathen Chinese, and lots of illustrators, political cartoonists, and that's a dominant exposure that most Americans have of this experience. But what's really unusual about this show is that it's really showing those same stories from a very different point of view. And part of what's moving is that there is a connection to the indigenous stories here as well. And there's a special insight, I think, that some of these artists have making that connection. So first of all, I wanted to say thank you so much to Dan Boxer and to Linton Boxers. Thank you both for being such incredible hosts. I really am delighted to be here. I also want to thank Judge Charles Williams. And also, I should say that the museum here has done a fantastic job. Julie Mattis, and also especially the curator, Emily Kappas, have really kind of excelled. And I have to say that this exhibit should be one that travels around the country, but unfortunately it's just too complicated to make that work. So you all who are here are really quite lucky to see this show, and I want to encourage you to spread the word. It's a show that's only going to be around for so long, and it really deserves a lot of attention. I hope they will be able to make a digital version of it. So let me just say a few words, and then words of introduction to the exhibit. And this is a flyer that you'll see in the film itself, and it's really quite typical of the kind of handbills that were passed out during the celebration of Chinese exclusion. Now, we can say that it was the Democratic Party that was really behind it, and the Republicans who were really very much trying to grapple with Reconstruction and support Reconstruction and pass the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments. But that would be not understanding the complexity of American history and how oftentimes parties will change roles in terms of what positions they're actually taking. So we don't want to take too much to say, oh, it's the Democrats or it's the Republicans, and to kind of characterize them or simplify what the story really is about. But really what we want to understand is that, of course, Chinese became victimized by these laws, but this is really about American history. So yes, I am a historian of Chinese American. I'm also a historian of New York City. And really what I look at is really American history, and what do these histories and stories tell us about American history, what's missing, what's being ignored, and what the ongoing issues that have to be addressed are. So my introduction is really just to kind of set this up a little bit, so the film is not understood as simply about Chinese and what this country did to the Chinese. Now this is a letter from Thomas Jefferson to Richard Price. He was in Paris at the time, January 8th, 1789. And the part that I've kind of boxed out, which is hard to read, says, wherever the people are well informed, they can be trusted with their own government. That whenever things get so far wrong as to attract their notice, they may be relied on to set them right. Okay? This is the ongoing challenge of American democracy. It's the ongoing challenge of our educational systems as well. It's the ongoing challenge of the media to play a role that actually informs and helps to give historical context. But it's also an unresolved issue because it's not always happening. So part of the role of these films and part of the role of a public historian, which is part of what I am, besides being a historian, I'm also committed to really working on exhibits, working on films, to make this available to a broad public, and not to somehow give some simple kind of presentation that's really full of a kind of romantic celebration of individual people or groups of people, but to begin to kind of tackle some of the tough questions that we're all a part of. So that's part of what this film is about. And this quote really highlights a kind of a fundamental challenge that we kind of have to take on in this country. Now, part of this is a challenge that the historian at Yale, David W. Blight, who's a Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer of Frederick Douglass, there's a book called Prophet of Freedom. He talks about the unfinished Second American Revolution. In other words, coming out of Reconstruction with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, those amendments are not entirely met. They're ongoing, they're unresolved. And that the first revolution may have resolved certain issues, but a lot of basic fundamental questions were not resolved. And it's really left unopened. It's left unresolved to this day. And part of what happened with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments is that women, and the vote for women, was also left unresolved. And a lot of the women's suffrage movement emerged really out of the lack of addressing it during Reconstruction. So these are not finished matters, and they are not matters that get resolved from simply the original Constitution or being, interpreting that very literally. The other historian I want to evoke is someone you may be aware of, Heather Cox Richardson. She writes a letter to Americans on a regular basis, and I think she's quite good, although I don't agree with everything that she writes about. But she wrote a book called How the South Won the Civil War. Oligarchy, democracy, and the continuing fight over this country. And it's a counterintuitive argument, but I just want to mention those two books and encourage you to look at them because they're actually part and parcel of what this documentary is about. Now, some of the complexity that I wanted to kind of frame here is that you have someone like Thomas Nast, who's coming out of a European kind of tradition of political cartoons. And first I should say the word nasty comes out of his name, okay? He was a satirist. He treated lots of people very critically with the honesty of his pen. And he also was complicated in the sense that he represented people oftentimes in racially caricaturized forms. So if you look at a lot of his work, it's complicated. But in fact, he was an early exponent of having Chinese have equal rights. So a lot of his political cartoons are about that. But oftentimes, it was at the sacrifice of other groups. So oftentimes, you'll see Irish people being cast as in very caricatured form, and Chinese as being favored. So that, again, is a complexity of American history that we need to kind of acknowledge, how groups oftentimes were pitted against each other to make a point. So this is Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving dinner, and you show a variety of people, and you show Castle Garden, the painting in the right in the background, which is really the original Ellis Island that's down by Battery Park. And you have these other kinds of representations showing that this country, in fact, is meeting the challenge of the Second American Revolution. And then we have this other image, which really speaks to, in fact, the more complex question that we're facing now, which is how the KKK and the White League really became most powerful after Reconstruction. And Jim Crow, Chinese exclusion, lots of what's happened in this country really, and eugenics. And eugenics was something that Hitler referred to in terms of how much he learned from American eugenicists. Madison Grant, in fact, who wrote The Passing of the Great Race, he was a patrician in New York, and someone I've looked at. New York, in fact, was ground zero of the international eugenics movement. And they began being emboldened by the Chinese Exclusion Act and by Jim Crow, thinking that they could then look at Europeans and began ranking Europeans and begin identifying who were the inferior Europeans. And just to give you a brief idea, the Mediterraneans, even despite Greek and Roman history, were considered the most inferior Europeans, and they were really referencing the Italians, who were coming in great numbers in the late 1800s. And then the Alpines were referenced as well. They're better than the Mediterraneans, but only so much. And who were they really talking about? They were talking about Jews, the great number of Jewish people who were migrating into the United States. And the superior people were Nordics. So in 1924, they passed an immigration law that was really defined by eugenics. So after the 1882 exclusion law, the 1924 eugenics law was saying, well, we're going to drop the number of inferior Europeans from coming into this country. So we've got a more complex history than we tend to know about. So a lot of the family members that have come and not come were really determined by these immigration laws. And this is very much linked to what was happening after Reconstruction as well, and the failure of the amendments that did not cover everyone. So I just wanted to present this complexity because in some ways the Chinese exclusion law film needs a bit of that kind of context. And we're hoping that people will begin to want to know about the history of their own peoples and the complex relationships that this Exclusion Act had to the communities that many of you come from. With that, we're going to show an introductory clip of the film. And I want to encourage you all to actually go on to PBS and get access to the full film. We're just showing you the very beginning, to give you a flavor of what the setup is, and we're going to show you a bit of the end. I'm kind of talking in between, but I'm not going to be able to kind of reproduce the film for you, but I'll be providing more of that kind of context. So we're going to show the beginning clip right now, and then I'll come back and give you a little bit of discussion about what you've seen. Okay, does that? Okay, great. This is working.
On June 30th, 1885, as the fundraising campaign for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty finally began to pick up speed, a letter appeared in the pages of the New York Sun. Written by a young Chinese immigrant and recent college graduate named Samsung Mo, who had come to America years earlier as a small boy and who dreamed of becoming a lawyer.
Sir, a paper was presented to me yesterday for subscription among my countrymen toward the pedestal fund of the Statue of Liberty. My countrymen and myself are honored in being thus appealed to as citizens in the cause of liberty. But the word liberty makes me think of the fact that this country is the land of liberty for all men of all nations, except the Chinese. That statue represents liberty holding a torch, which lights the passage of those of all nations who come into this country. But are the Chinese allowed to come? Are the Chinese here allowed to enjoy liberty as men of all other nationalities enjoy it? Free from the insults, abuse, assaults, wrongs, and injuries from which men of other nationalities are free. By the law of this nation, a Chinaman cannot become a citizen. whether this statute against the Chinese or the Statue of Liberty will be the more lasting monument to tell future ages of the liberty and greatness of this country, will be known only to future generations. Samsungbo.
The solitary arm of the unfinished Statue of Liberty had languished on Madison Square in New York for more than 5 years, when on May 6, 1882, on the eve of the greatest wave of immigration in American history, President Chester A. Arthur signed into law an extraordinary piece of federal legislation. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, and it was unlike any law enacted since the founding of the Republic. Singling out as never before a specific race and nationality for exclusion, it made it illegal for Chinese workers to come to America, and for Chinese nationals already here ever to become citizens of the United States. Fueled by deep-seated tensions over race and class and national identity that had been festering since the founding of the Republic, it was the first in a long line of acts targeting the Chinese for exclusion, and it would remain in force for more than 60 years. It continues to shape the debate about what it means to be an American to this day.
I was told if I lift this up, it's a little better. Does that sound better? Okay, great. So I guess part of what I'd like to talk about is that in academia, scholarship just doesn't automatically happen. It depends on whether there are people who are doing that research and getting the support to do that research. So a number of the books that you see out on that table in the bookstore, and a lot of the scholars who then helped supported the work for the exhibit upstairs, but also the group of people that I've been a part of, are really an early generation of those of us who are able to get our PhDs and begin getting jobs in academia. So part of what you're seeing is the beginning of community historical societies who are building up collections and archives, and then eventually convincing universities that this is an important area of study. Now, this may sound unusual, but many of you may remember that it wasn't until World War II that indeed that academia became more diverse. Up until then, it was more the kind of limited area for those who came from white Anglo-Saxon Protestant backgrounds. But it was the GI Bill that enabled Jews, Italians, many other people to be able to get in, but it still excluded certain groups of people, I should say, and that's really important. And those are the same people who are able to get support for loans, for moving into a suburban house, but it also excluded other people. So this is an ongoing kind of challenge in terms of how we think about American history and how we think about Chinese Americans and whether Chinese Americans should be excluded or included. So what happened in 1882 was that Chinese laborers were excluded from this country. It was built up over the 1870s, and the West Coast especially, in which there are strong lynchings. There are many towns that were called sundown towns in which you had to leave town by sundown, or you would risk being lynched or your house being burned down. These are variations of what was happening in the South, but I should say in the Midwest and the Northeast, communities were not innocent of the kind of racial antagonisms that we also know happened with indigenous people And part of what I'm doing now is reconstructing the history of enslavement and dispossession in the New York metropolitan region. And if we look in the 1600s, we realize that actually a lot of that was happening. So in some ways, there's a continuous ongoing history of this. And I'm not saying this for us to feel guilty or bad. I'm really just saying that we need to be able to look at these stories and be able to understand the context of this museum and the paintings that you're seeing and the sculptures you're seeing, but also to understand that some of this complexity are pieces of American history that you may have heard about, but you may not be aware of the role it plays. So, for example, if you look at this journal, which is a very popular journal, Phrenology. I don't know how many of you have heard about phrenology. Yeah, okay. Some of you have. And there's also the notion of physiognomy, which is like, okay, phrenology was based on the bumps on your head. Okay, so if you had certain bumps in parts of your head, you're considered to have those traits in abundance or deficiencies. Physiognomy was measuring your nose, measuring your forehead. There's a theory that those with high foreheads were more intelligent. And oftentimes those who are seen as having low foreheads were linked to racial differences, skulls and measurements of skulls and capacities. But also legs and arms and, all sorts of measurements were made that were part of the physiognomy. They were all contributing towards this notion that there are hierarchies of races, but also there are inferior peoples. Peoples with disabilities were dangerous, because if you had a disabled person in your family, there's somehow a genetic defect, and that would risk polluting and degenerating anybody that person had contact with, whether through marriage or through family relations. So there are some very tricky, difficult issues that appear now to be a separate issue, disability rights, or African American studies, or Chinese American studies. But in fact, through how this racial science was emerging in the US, they were all interlinked in many ways. So it's important to kind of understand that science and knowledge were highly inflected by these kinds of questions. And that, again, we've got a Thomas Nast image in which Columbia, who's oftentimes represented as the kind of feminine spirit of progress, of education for the United States. Columbia, District of Columbia, that kind of manifest destiny, floating spirit in a kind of a white gown floating across, moving westward. Here you have Columbia being represented by Thomas Nast. And this is the image I was referencing, but there are many images. If you look up Thomas Nast online, you'll see many of them, in which she's favoring the poor Chinaman, that was the term that was used at the time, who was being really treated as a barbarian or as a rat eater, represented in all these common ways. And now that we have the internet, you can kind of see these materials. But this is very common at the time, and this is all part of the movement to really develop fear, but also to cast a stigma upon Chinese. So she's protecting the Chinese, this Chinaman, from the Irish mob. Okay, you wouldn't know they're Irish because they're oftentimes represented in such grotesque, kind of animal-like, ape-like form. And the Irish were represented as, quote-unquote, the niggers of Europe, right? So any of you from Irish background, you probably know some of these stories, but it's a complicated way in which there's kind of a racial triangulation of one group pitted against another group and saying, well, it's the Irish who are the ones who are prejudiced. But of course we know there's a more complex dynamic in the different regions of the United States. So the Irish were oftentimes blamed. The ignorant Irish in San Francisco and the West Coast were blamed for why the anti-Chinese laws happened. But it's just not that simple. It's just not that simple. And then you have the kind of invisible third party, which is Lady Columbia kind of protecting the Chinaman in this case and really saying the Irish are a problem. And we know there are Protestant Catholic tensions that are also involved in the history of the country. Another complicating dimension that I wanted to share with you is really this tea set. So we know, for example, that George Washington, and this is part of the work I've done in the research, he was so focused on getting the latest Chinese porcelains on his Revolutionary War headquarters as he was moving from place to place, that he would go to a British Chinaman, Chinese porcelain salesperson, who would then supply him with these latest porcelain goods, because it would represent being a good gentleman, having a really good tea set and having the proper tea set. And this is during the days in which people really didn't have these things. People had maybe a knife, a bowl, and they're living in really basic conditions. But being a good gentleman and a good gentlewoman, a good founding father and mother, these tea sets were really very prized. And China represented the wealth of Asia and the aristocracy and merchants of Europe, but also the United States, wanted to have these things, So this is a tea set that was developed by Carl Mueller, who was from Germany, but he had moved to Long Island City in Brooklyn. And he created this in 1863, and this was actually shown at the 1876 Philadelphia Exposition. If you look carefully at the finial, the lid, you'll see that a classic Chinaman who was being excluded, and being kind of caricaturized during this time, 60s, 70s, and 80s, is gracing the tea pot. And then there's African American caricatured head for the sugar bowl, okay, in terms of plantation sugar. And then there's kind of a grotesque kind of animal-like creature at the spout with wings at the tea spout. And then you have a goat representing the milk, etc., right? So this is kind of a more hybrid kind of representation that is not so straightforward. It's a complication of Chinese, African Americans, enslaved peoples being kind of represented in a really kind of exquisite piece of porcelain tea set, in which Mueller was very proud and kind of exemplifying as the American ability to demonstrate that Americans were able to make porcelain teacups as good as the Chinese, right? So boy, these are complicated questions, and it kind of raises the question of how can we understand these things as complex expressions of the swirling nature of American history that we're all part of, but we tend not to know about, and we tend to get kind of simple bite-sized bits of history that are easier to digest. So part of what I'm trying to frame is, if when you see the Chinese Exclusion Act film, you'll be confronted with these more complex dimensions that are interlinked to the other histories that maybe you know more about, or the histories of your own families that you may know more about. But the goal here is to begin to understand these as intertwined, complicating stories: Irish, Chinese, Jews, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, Catholics, all these different kinds of intersectional ways in which these issues kind of come in contact with each other. Now, here we kind of finally arrive at maybe some of the images that were very popular during the anti-Chinese movement. Now, one thing I wanted to kind of discuss, which is the issue that oftentimes we have a very hard time with in American culture, is really how class actually works. And this may be too small, so I have to apologize for this, but I'll just describe it briefly. This is meant to be an octopus, okay, with all its tentacles kind of grasping on different occupations that this railroad monopoly, which is being built across the United States, is basically usurping. So the railroads going across, the Transcontinental Railroad is taking over the shipping companies, so that's that first, and then the carriage industry, which is oftentimes the source of the mail that's going across the country, so that is being taken over. And then miners are being shown as being kind of displaced because their land is being taken with the building of the railroad. So it's really just an expression of how the anti-monopoly feelings of the railroads, which was a very strong feeling, and the railroads were increasingly understood as really creating technological changes on the scale that perhaps the internet, we can understand the internet and the smartphones that we have now as disrupting everyday society. And therefore the kind of fears and anxieties that are associated with these dramatic changes that are happening in society. Now, I'm just pointing this out. This is a piece done by George Frederick Keller. It's called The Curse of California, and it's for a publication called The Wasp. And it was published out of San Francisco. And in the eyes are Leland Stanford, who was one of the big four, and also Charles Crocker. Charles Crocker had a major bank that many people from California may still remember. Leland Stanford, of course, was at Stanford University and other kinds of significance. So they were seen as the big four who were kind of dominating the West and causing the disruption onto the culture and the settlement that was just emerging. So let's not forget that it's really 1848 that gold is discovered, right? And then all of a sudden, this was Mexican lands, Mexican territories. And all of a sudden, there's a rush, a massive rush to go to California and going there. So this was a scene by the white settlers in which they're seeing the life that they were trying to develop and the stake they're trying to create was being disrupted by the great octopus of the railroad monopoly. Now I show this because this kind of image then gets transferred to Chinese. And this really becomes part of the source of how Chinese become blamed and the fears and anxieties that the monopolists that are being targeted towards the monopolists, and they have more of the power to make the decisions about labor and contracting Chinese labor and contracting Irish labor to build the railroad. And they're going across indigenous lands that we know of. So we can see the intermingling of these stories, and in fact, the very notion of manifest destiny that many of us learned about in high school is really, that was originally done for a railroad company as a way to kind of talk about how to promote selling tickets for the railroads, right? How do you move westward, right? But this is an image in which you have the Chinese octopus, in which it's a grotesque caricature of a Chinese face. So you see this face and you begin to associate all sorts of caricatures. What kind of human being looks like this? And in some ways you can say, well, this person is maybe distorted, doesn't look proper. So people can say this is a disabled person, or this is someone who's a Mongolian idiot, which is, of course, a term that many of you may remember for referring to Down syndrome, right? So disability, grotesque, monsters that are emerging in American culture are all kind of interconnected with these images, especially in the popular culture. And this grotesque Chinaman is basically taking over all these occupations and causing these poor white boys to not have jobs and be delinquents on the side. And the policeman, oftentimes an Irish policeman, is sending them off to a reformatory in the background, right? So again, we've got these complex images that are part of what was going on at the time that then culminated in the anti-Chinese movement. So part of what I'm hoping to do is for us to have some time to talk about these complexities that are going on that I'm kind of throwing at you. This other image is one that is done by the same artist, Keller. All of these images are done by Keller. And this one is more complicated again, because Keller is not just talking about the Chinese, but he's talking about this machine of progress, which is taking in the raw materials coming down the chute. There are pigs and cows and other things that are feeding into the machine. There's an elephant in there feeding into this machine of progress. And the mouth, the maw of the machine is spitting out all these goods that are made from the factories, basically. And all these ready-made goods of hats and barrels, shoes, beds, all these things are being made by the machines now. And then you've got these white working men who are standing by the side out of work. So it's a variation of the other image. And then let me just show you, that's a close-up of what's being spit out. And this one man is kind of facing you as if he's kind of telling you the story of what's going on, right, from his point of view. You see the despondent man who's there in the forefront. You see their tools, that were the hand tools of the proud American work that was being done on the farms and whatever. And then you see the machine basically spitting out this work and displacing them. Now, part of what's complicated is the title of this that's in the smokestack. And many of you probably can't see it, but it says, "The Real Chinaman Who is at the Root of All Evil." Now, the question, oh, thank you so much. I appreciate that. Thanks. Okay, so that's a tricky one, right? So who's the Chinaman here? Is it the machine? Or is it the shadowy figure in the background? You see the shadowy figure who's holding the lever that seems to be operating the machine, maybe turning it on, who is a caricatured Chinaman with a Q. Okay, so what I'm sharing with you is even at the time of the exclusion laws, a political cartoonist who was working for WASP, which was very anti-Chinese, and part of the reason why the West Coast became a series of sundown towns, and the lynchings that were happening against Chinese was happening. This paper was very much behind it. But at the same time, as a satirical journal, there is some complexity here that was showing the tensions of what was going on and the debates that were happening at the time. So we're just getting a little window into that, and these illustrations give us that kind of insight and window. So part of what I'd love to talk about, so I'm not giving kind of a straightforward lecture. I do want to encourage all of you to watch the film, and you're going to get more of a narrative about how Chinese exclusion happened and unfolded, and you'll get to see the end part in a short while. But I'm hoping we can have a bit of discussion as well about these complexities and how they get played out over time in your lifetimes, in your experience, but also today. And, you know, how is it that certain kinds of curriculum are forbidden and certain kinds of curriculum are encouraged? And why is that happening? And how can we begin to talk about that in a way that hopefully can cross over some of the silos and separations that a lot of our identities and a lot of our experiences continue to perpetuate and promote? So part of the spirit, I believe, of these kinds of discussions is to really begin to bridge these things. This exhibit does that beautifully. And the film, I think, also does that. So I'm hoping we can have a bit of an opportunity to discuss these complexities and really begin to address this question of who's at the root of all this evil. Is it the Chinaman? Who's hiring this quote-unquote Chinaman to come out to the West Coast? The very early factories that are emerging during the Civil War because the North and the South are fighting. So the factories in the North are not operating anymore. So the factories in the West Coast are the very first the factories that are supplying the coats and boots for the country, but also for the soldiers, right? And some of the very first people who are working in the fields and factories are also Chinese. So the exclusion is also against the displacement that the factories are causing of the white working men. And the Chinese are being blamed as a reason for that. So having said that, okay, we're going to kind of give you a segment of the end of the film. And then again, I want to encourage you to go online and watch the whole film and begin to see the complexity of the argument that's being played out. But how this is a film, again, being told from the Asian American, Chinese American historical point of view. We're part of a generation of people who finally were able to get positions in universities to be able to teach this. And we're not unique. The same thing happened with Jews at City College, for example, in New York City. Jews were fighting to get into the teaching in the city university system. They could not get into the Ivy Leagues. Those are very they were considered exclusive admissions policies, and they were fighting to broaden the curriculum so that it would not be strictly a Christian curriculum in the City University of New York. And these were fights that were going on everywhere in the country. And these are changes that we tend to take for granted today, but in fact, they were never to be taken for granted. These were things that happened, and these are pushbacks, and so in many ways, we're still living with that kind of complexity and challenge today. So let me just show the end section of this film, and then we'll have a chance to really discuss. So I'm hoping you kind of keep the questions and concerns and complexities from your own experiences so we can talk about that a little bit. Okay, great. So here's the end segment, which is about, this is the end segment. No? Okay, here we go. Oops, no, sorry. That's too fast. I hope I didn't mess this up. Okay, here we go. Nope, bring too far back.
Try the arrow on the. No, you gotta try the arrow on the computer. Go forward.
Ah, great. Okay, you're the magic touch. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'll come back at the end of the segment. I think the segment's about 12 minutes, so you'll get a sense of it.
The repeal comes because of the politics of the war and not because there's a realization that Chinese should not be excluded based on moral grounds.
On December 17, 1943, the Chinese exclusion laws were officially repealed with the passage of the Magnuson Act, which kept in place laws prohibiting Chinese nationals from owning property, but which did permit, for the first time in nearly 62 years, a small number of Chinese workers to enter the country every year, in strict accordance with the 1924 quota system.
In 1943, it was repealed, but the repeal was quite symbolic. The quota was only 105. It's so insignificant.
Yeah. What's important about it is that it's 105 Chinese a year, not just people from China. So it's 105 a year based on blood. You could come from one and you were part of that 105. And it's the only country that was treated that way. And it's based on the 1924 quota of 105 being the bare minimum. So the Chinese got the bare minimum to door price, yeah.
Nevertheless, it is very significant that the Chinese now have the right to be naturalized, to become naturalized citizens in this country.
It is an important opening because first, on principle, the idea of exclusion is overturned. That's huge. That no longer marks Chinese as the one group who by name cannot enter the United States. That's a huge victory. And it also opens up opportunities for Chinese to come. Chinese men can now bring their wives over from China, right, where they couldn't before under the War Brides Act.
Immigration to America was at an all-time low, when on the verge of the 1960s, a sea change began to occur in federal policy towards immigrants, who for the first time in American history would soon find themselves officially embraced as a crucial and defining aspect of the American experience.
It's a very recent phenomenon. It's a post-World War II, a Cold War and civil rights phenomenon. In the 1950s, Senator John F. Kennedy published A Nation of Immigrants, advocating for reform of immigration laws at that time. Kennedy believed that not only was there a civil rights prerogative, but also a Cold War international relations prerogative to be changing these discriminatory immigration laws because we were shutting out the vast majority of people from around the world while also proclaiming ourselves the land of freedom, democracy, and the American way.
The sea change would be consecrated in 1965 in a landmark piece of federal legislation called the Hart-Celler Act, which in the years to come would dramatically transform the face of America.
The Hart-Celler Act is an immigration law that really took away those national race-based quotas and instead tried to make immigration much more fair and even and across the board. When the senators and congressmen debated the passage of the Immigration Act, they had no idea what was going to happen. But the reality is that because the Hart-Celler Act privileged certain occupations like the medical fields, the science industry fields, Asian immigration completely skyrocketed and changed completely the face of Asian American communities.
You have a disproportionate number of highly educated Asians who came in under the 1965 Act. This is a period of expanding economy in the United States with more and more R&D work, technical work. Now, a curious consequence of the Hart-Celler Act is that we're still left with the idea that Chinese are other. They may not be the yellow peril of the 19th century and early 20th century, but now they're the super achieving students who keep your kids out of college, right? So they're either evil or super achievers, but the Chinese never stop being the other. They never can seem to find a place of just being part of the mainstream.
With the passage of time, memories of the Chinese exclusion era, so painful for Chinese Americans themselves, faded from public view and were forgotten. In a nation that now preferred to think of itself, in principle at least, as having always welcomed immigrants.
Those of us who are descendants of paper sons and discovering that you're a descendant of a paper son. That generation, my generation, who did not know that our grandfathers were paper sons, because it was a secret that was kept in our families and never talked about. And then one day, perhaps before a funeral or before a birthday party or something is said that lets everyone know, and you realize, oh, that's why we never talk about him, or oh, that's why that family in Chinatown is related to us, but we can't figure out why or something. It's because of that legacy of exclusion and getting around exclusion. And once you realize that, then that sense of alienation, perhaps, or that sense of understanding that you are a legacy of exclusion hits you. And you realize, oh, I'm part of that long history of immigration, exclusion, assimilation, acculturation, or marginalization. All of those processes that take place has its seeds in exclusion. It made me feel even more part of that flow of generations of that Chinese experience in America. And for those generations who came after, who didn't have to face exclusion, I don't think they fully understand it because they never had to deal with it.
The history of Chinese exclusion highlights that we have had a complicated relationship about immigration from the very beginning. And that it's that duality of welcoming immigrants, of understanding their need, our dependence on them, how they contribute to the United States, as well as our fear and anxiety of the different changing demographics, changing economic structure. That has made us who we are. That duality and our complicated relationship of immigration has shaped who we are as a nation. It shaped our economy, our society, our politics, and it continues to shape our ongoing understanding of what it means to be an American and how we continue to debate that to this day.
When we look back, I think we can learn that the Chinese have this resilient faith in the founding principles. I think that's Chinese Americans' contribution to this grand American experiment. The exclusion law can be seen as a fundamental flaw, a huge mistake in that historical process of great experiment. I think if you really look at this system, you can also say that the exclusion law was democratic, was legal, but it was wrong. So something wrong could be done in that process of building a democratic system there. On the other hand, even under the enormous difficult circumstances, with so many disillusions, so many disappointment, and so much suffering, generations of Chinese Americans never give up their faith and their hope. And I think that's very remarkable.
Okay, so I'd love to just open this process up a little bit, and we do have a microphone, so we'd love to kind of hear your thoughts, and so if you could just raise your hand. We've got someone up here, and there are other people around the room who'd like to kind of say something. So let's, thanks, Julie. It's a large room to be running across. Yeah, anything you have thought about? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It's a lot to unpack, and of course, I think the audience feels very grateful to have you here and to have your message, most importantly. I like to discuss what's overlooked or what might be overlooked, and one thing that struck me was the 1943 repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and about that time, there was Karamatsu. And I wonder what kind of comparison or relationship you might draw between Karamatsu, which involved Japanese internment, and the Chinese exclusion experience.
It's a wonderful question, a very important question, because it also has to do with the formulation of what Asian American Studies is about, and how Chinese Americans and Asian and Japanese Americans begin to talk to each other. I was raised by a mother who lived through being in Shanghai during the Japanese bombing and Japanese occupation. So I grew up in the Midwest with my mother refusing to buy any Japanese goods. We could not buy that Panasonic radio that I really wanted, so I could listen to the Beatles, just couldn't do that. But I think as a number of us began to go to college at the time, we began to kind of meet each other and begin to kind of think about, well, so we're not meant to talk to each other by, oftentimes the Chinese parents didn't want you to be associated with the Japanese Americans. And there are other complications with other groups as well, so we can think about that. And, and that as we began to talk more, we began to realize that there are actually some deep histories and deep patterns that we weren't aware of. So part of the deep pattern that's impacted Japanese and Chinese Americans in particular is that for the longest time, when the Japanese were successful in defeating the Russians, for example, in the kind of Russo-Japanese War, and they did it by building a Western-style battleship. The Japanese quickly were perceived as really being the kind of saviors of the Asian race and being the honorable white people who would be there. So you could read about that. You can see that, how that was discussed in Western colonial imperialist literature, for example. You'd have the same kind of dinner table around with the Japanese being at the table of the European powers. So for the longest time, the Japanese were seen as the favorable Asians who were going to save Asia and make Asia more compatible with Europeans. And the Chinese, during the Chinese exclusion period, were seen as really the mass of people who are heathens, and you're not able to make them modern. But with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, you have suddenly that image being switched. So historically, we always have the favorable Asian and the bad Asian. That's always been a pattern in US history. And the groups are switching around. And in the case of Japanese Americans, until we as Chinese Americans began learning about the Japanese American history of incarceration and being put into concentration camps, and they began learning about the history of Chinese exclusion, that also got extended to other quote-unquote Asiatics, you know. So then you'd have different Chinese being excluded, and then you'd have Koreans coming in or Japanese coming in, working the same fields, Filipinos coming in, and increasingly each of those groups became part of some kind of fear-mongering and became excluded as well. So we have all those complexities until we began piecing that together on college campuses and creating our own little study groups and began kind of writing journals and magazines to try to understand what was going on, how can you explain this? And let's not forget, for me, this is in the context, and many of our classmates, this is in the context of the war in Vietnam. And here I am at the University of Wisconsin being called a kook, you know, and I thought, you know, I'm one of the good guys, you know, I'm a Chinese person, I'm not a Vietnamese, you know. So I began thinking about what does that mean? What does this fear and racialization mean? And how do we begin to understand that as a more complex dynamic? So in the case of, I think, this comparison between Korematsu and the resistance the Korematsu case represents, and other Supreme Court cases. I mean, we can put it alongside the case of Wong Kim Ark, who reached the Supreme Court in 1898. And it's really testing the amendment that was saying that someone born on American soil is an American citizen. But this is a question of, well, so can a Chinese who's being excluded, but being born on American soil, count as an American citizen? Right? So this is a Supreme Court ruling, and I have to tell you that there's a personal reason why this is an important case for me, because I am an anchor baby. The only reason I'm in this country is because my parents, who were on a visitor's visa, you know, now I know saying this risks, you know, the people who are in support of getting rid of birthright citizenship, you know, so this makes me a target. But the only reason I was born is when my father, who was a refugee from China in 1949, wanted to try to find some way to stay in this country, to be with his children, my siblings, who are much older, senators, people who were saying, well, the only way you can do it, because the quota, the 105-person quota had already been met. And by the way, the 105-person quota was based on the eugenics laws. It's based on the number of Chinese who came in 1890, and it was considered 2% of that group. Okay. And this is already during exclusion. So the 105 was met very quickly. It could be met probably in one day. And we could not get that exemption. So the only way they could do it was because of the Wong Kim Ark case in 1898 that then said that by being born in American soil, the parents could stay. The kid was an American citizen and the parents could stay. Now that's changed, right? That's been challenged. So this is an ongoing push and pull and an ongoing conflict between those who appear to be of one racial group which is itself a problematic descriptor of Japanese and Chinese, or Filipinos and Japanese, or Koreans and Japanese, because Asia, of course, has its own history of complexity. But once people begin to arrive in this country, that complexity is added to, and the new experience begins to happen in terms of an Asian American experience. And this includes adoptees that happen, Asian adoptees, a different kind of identity and a different kind of way in which race is understood and formulated. So, we can get into the specifics of that. It's an excellent question. I don't know if you wanted to add to that, but thank you for that. Let's just make sure that other points and questions can also, and you don't have to ask a question, you can just kind of raise a provocation if you want to do that too. I'd welcome that as well. Yes.
So immigration in this country from the very beginning, every group that came next was looked upon as not white enough, not Catholic enough, not going to fit in, et cetera, et cetera. The Chinese were brought in first to work on the gold rush and then the railroad. And the comment I want from you is, it amazes me how much fear and anxiety white America had for the Chinese, considering how small that population of people that were here. Nobody ever mentions, if my numbers are in the ballpark, a couple 100,000 in this country when the population in 1850 was about 25 million, and the disproportionate amount of fear that existed.
Thank you. You sound like you might be a school teacher. Are you a school teacher?
I'm an accountant. But,
You're an accountant. Okay, so you're good at numbers. But not all accountants know about these numbers, so that's fantastic. Thank you.
I just taught with another guy an 8-hour class last spring on immigration, and this was one of those.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah. You're absolutely right. So that's why these political cartoons, even though they appear to be a little bit comical to us, our eyes today, were very powerful. They were color lithographs. They appeared once a week, once a month. But they were really part of the new technology of the time that began to visualize in the same way that we think of today. They began to visualize the fears and concerns and anxieties that were being expressed. It was a way in which that happened. And those papers then were far smaller in the numbers of publication and their access than we have today, with everybody having a smartphone, everybody having a computer. So in some ways, the challenges that we now have, even of communities of smaller numbers, and how those issues can be blown up in such a large degree that all of a sudden it becomes the big question, which really oftentimes displaces the other issues that are going on, are dominating what's going on. So, I feel hesitant to say this because I'm aware I'm in Florida, and I know there's a lot of issues about the debate about climate issues and global warming. But if we were to accept that is the issue of our lifetime, and that's the issue of our generations who are following us, our children's children's children, that they're going to be facing a very difficult time. If we think of that, then how are we being distracted? And how are the everyday issues that are kind of coming up and being magnified? And in some ways, I'm very mindful of this time in which the U.S. and Israel and what's happening in the Gaza, right? And whatever position you take on that, we're not talking about that, but war creates enormous fossil fuel burning and enormous impacts on whatever little tiny impact we saw during COVID, in which things were loosening up a little bit. We could begin seeing nature come back. We could begin seeing creatures and whales kind of coming back to parts of the country that we'd not been seeing them. So how do we begin to kind of think about these issues together, and how do we try to prevent being distracted by how these things are magnified and really used, I think, So that's my point of view as a scholar and historian. But I would invite all of you to be thinking about what are the ways in which that does happen. Let's. I'm not sure who's next, but let's. Maybe this woman over here. That would be good to get. Yeah, thank you. And then someone in the front also has his hand up. Yeah.
Yeah. Currently, we have a very complex relationship with China.
Yeah.
And it's in the news because of the meeting.
Yes.
Do you feel that it echoed our position in the United States, echoes our history.
It does. It does. It caused me it caused me a lot of worry. And I was just in a conference a couple years ago in Vienna, in which those in Central Europe were feeling the pressure of the United States through NATO to somehow begin supporting the U.S. policy as it was changing towards China. And what worries me, separate from, I don't believe any country is so pure, and the United States have plenty of things to account for and atone for. China does as well, so I'm not saying that it's any one place is pure or romanticize one country over another and demonize another country. But I am concerned of the two nations that can do the most damage and the most good in terms of fossil fuels. The United States historically is a major burner of fossil fuels that have accumulated in the atmosphere. China is now, not helping that. But both countries are actually investing heavily now, but China had been, in solar panels, in batteries, in electric cars, things like that. We tend not to know about the numbers, but if you look at the New York Times or go online, you actually see that there's actually enormous investment, much larger than this country. But I think the only way we're going to solve the climate issues is really if both countries cooperate. And the difficulty is that we can easily come up with the warts, the W-A-R-T-S, the warts that any country has, and emphasize that, and say, well, they're not as good as we used to think they were. But if we're to apply that to the various countries that are our allies, it's also a problem. So there's always a selective, this gets back to the selective attention that's happening. And can we stay focused on, from my point of view, the biggest question that we really all need to be thinking about for our future generation. So that's a great question, and I think we're going into a Cold War. I'm hoping that we can avoid that. But I'm hoping it's not just avoiding that, but we can get rid of the kind of notion of changing a country by sanctions, which has not worked, and begin to think about how to create incentives for cooperation. And after all, I was speaking to a gentleman earlier before we started, that if you look at our graduate schools, a lot of our graduate schools are made up of foreign students in the sciences and engineering, and they're not made up of too many US-born students, in part because US-born students don't want to go into these fields so much. So they're trying to get them into these graduate programs and into the best graduate programs, but a lot of them are Europeans, a lot of them are Africans, a lot of them are from Asia, Latin America. So a lot of what is considered American inventions are actually built on the foreign students and the labor power we have from them, and that's been true for Asian Americans as well. So we have to get out of this kind of romantic notion that these are this American progress, and that somehow if we can just become nationalist enough, we're going to solve the world's problems. It's just not going to happen. It's always been a global solution. Solar panels have been not just one country, but many different technological breakthroughs that have enabled that to happen and enabled them to be inexpensive so that we can now adopt them for our use. Excuse me, I think this gentleman up here, if you wanted to say something.
Well, when I think about the work that you're doing and the presentation now, this information you're revealing work that, why has it taken so long to bring it to the forefront, and what has created an opening for this work to emerge now, in your opinion? This is things that I should have known already. And, I was born in '59, and it just seems like what allows us to miss this information.
Yeah, I think we have a country that believes in kind of rugged individualism, so, therefore I'm a genius, and that's why I can claim, make these claims. That's not the case, I can assure you. But it's really generations in which they begin to get into universities and begin to get these opportunities. So it's really only because of the immigration law changes and that a certain generation of young people went into colleges during the war in Vietnam, and we began questioning certain things, and we began looking at the history. But the same could be said for African Americans or other groups at different points in time, kind of rising to the challenges of the time of the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, and developing and supporting a generation of scholars that are the foundation for African American studies. But again, we have to say that African American studies is not about just African Americans, just as women's studies is not just about women. It's actually about how do we reformulate what American history and what the we actually means, and who's been excluded from the we, but what the unheralded contributions and challenges that a larger we makes. So we are an American experience, as Professor Runcho Yu was saying at the end. It's not a finished experiment. There is no preordained answer to any of these questions. George Washington was both a brilliant man, but also had his own human moments in which he was very much a part of a person of his time and what he was doing in terms of he and his father were surveyors. And they were already defying the British decree saying, no, don't go west of the Appalachians. And he was already staking out land in Ohio for himself. So we just have to be able to think about people and ourselves as more complex. And I think that's the breakthrough, is that that kind of simplistic civics kind of history is forever changed. But I think the villainization now of what's happening in universities and this research is also very dangerous, because there's a chilling effect that that kind of attitude has, and that kind of scapegoating has. So I'm really worried that we're entering into a period of witch hunting again, which goes back to Puritan days, but also goes back to McCarthy, and we can talk about all that. Yes, ma'am. Yes. Okay. Maybe the gentleman back there, and then we can come up front and then go to the side here. Yeah.
I had a question that was more curriculum-based. I recently retired as a social studies teacher for 25 years.
Yeah, congratulations. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your work.
And we send them to you. In any case, I did see the transition where many of us in the room are more Eurocentric taught. The immigrant experience and so forth. It's Ellis Island, it's the Germans, the Italians, Slavic nations, etc.
Which is important. Yeah.
Well, it is important,
yeah.
Of course. And living in such a large nation, we're not West-centric in terms of California or what have you. So the curriculum could be a little bit different that way. However, my question is this. I suppose we understand the motivations of Europeans to come to this country, better life and so forth, and I guess the real beginning of Chinese immigration is during the Qing dynasty, 1850s or so. I guess my question is, what were the motivations? Because as I've seen the transition from Eurocentric to a world-centric curriculum, you can't hit everything, and textbooks certainly don't cover the reason, other than building the railroad, why the Chinese came here. But I wonder if you might be able to enlighten us a little bit more.
No, you're asking a great question, and it's going to require a very long answer. I'm not going to give you a long answer, but part of my work has been saying, well, the California story is important, and the gold rush was important, and the railroads are important, but the China trade was really foundational. And we've tended not to acknowledge that, or we tend to think of that, oh, that's another field, and we don't deal with that as another field, but we have to be able to integrate all these pieces and understandings, and saying that with George Washington being fixated, as his generation was, as his British counterparts were fixated on getting these luxury goods, and what did that mean, for them? What did it symbolize for them? It's kind of like, having that prized, handbag or that prized set of golf clubs. It said something about your consumption and your knowledge and your superiority and your status and how hard you worked. So without understanding the China trade and what did China want, which is the question of the time, and then how the Opium Wars developed and reversed China's fortunes, and that China became a debtor nation, addicted to opium. And all the silver that was in China that the West wanted basically came west, right? And it's not like the silver belonged to China. The silver was from the Manila Acapulco trade. I mean, we got to go back and understand these dynamics, you know. So I think these missing stories then help to kind of put California's story into perspective and help to understand why Chinese merchants, Chinese scholars, Chinese students were exempted from the exclusion laws, but it was the laborers who were excluded, right? So, I mean, I'm just kind of beginning to suggest the more complex story that needs to be there. And part of what's emerged out of a new generation of indigenous scholars, North American indigenous scholars, we're at the golden age of that scholarship now. They are saying, well, we have to acknowledge what happened. And what happened was not just about us and the dispossession of our lands, but what happened also was tied to and how enslavement was linked to dispossession of lands, and how massive extraction of the deforestation of the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut region, of Maine, et cetera, massive extraction was in part for building wealth and power, but also for what did China want? And how could they trade lumber for something else to get to the point of what China wanted? Now, it's not just China, of course, but it's really how global trade and what Alexander Hamilton talked about in terms of political arithmetic. How does political arithmetic work in terms of trade? So do you maximize the deforestation in Maine so that those who have the ability to have the ships to profit from that, the people who are basically brokering the lumber? If you read Annie Proulx's book, Barkskins, a novel, but it actually talks about deforestation of the Canadian and Maine forest beautifully, you get an insight as to how extractivism works in that context in terms of trade, in terms of enslavement, in terms of dispossession of lands. So those are interconnected, and in some ways, back to this gentleman's point, some of these things are just so obvious, but we tend not to think about them together in relationship to each other, and that's the challenge now. And that's why this new generation of indigenous scholars are talking about, well, actually there's such a thing as, that's called settler colonialism. And that's different than immigration. And that we have to understand that the colonial period of this nation, especially if we think about the 13 colonies, was really a settler colonial situation in which land was pushed out, enslaved people were brought in, extractivism was happening, and trade was really driving it all. And that's an important prior condition that set up immigration coming in, because enslavement, once that stopped, once Chinese indentures and Chinese labor is stopped, then you need to bring in European labor. And a lot of our families come out of that background. So it's not just immigration and being an immigrant nation. Prior to that, it's really about settler colonialism. That's an obvious kind of thing if we were to look at, piece together the specializations, but it hasn't been done by historians until now with indigenous scholars doing that. So in part, it's a response to saying, well, Asian American scholars can do certain kind of work and labor, but it's really through all these other groups now finally getting to do the scholarship and developing the archives and writing essays and writing books that's beginning to change what American history is about. And there are people who are fearful of that. It's very challenging. It's too complicated. It's not just about one evil person that we all have to label as our enemy, and somehow that's going to solve our problems. So I'm sorry, again, I don't want to take too much time, but I believe, yes, and then we've got someone over here, and then someone back here. Yes, okay, back there in the 1, 2, 3, 4th row in the back. Yeah, okay.
I guess it's a question, but one of the things that I've noticed, and I consider myself an armchair historian, is that America is built on myths, and it's also built on, I won't say greed, I'll just say the capitalistic model certain fits here. But it carries over into the education of our children. And that's an area in which we fail because we do not teach the honest story of America. And one of the things that I find extremely interesting and ironic is that the affirmative action case that was brought against Harvard was brought by Asian Americans. And America has existed for all of these years, since the 1600s, by pitting one group against another group. And I don't see any end to that. I wonder if you do.
Well, so thank you for that point. I think you're spot on. It's complicated because there's a coalition of people who are also basically trying to break affirmative action, who are not of Asian descent, and kind of collaborating with these parents. I should just tell you, for the exhibit at the New York Historical Society, there was a very wealthy international Chinese person who has real estate in China and major holdings in this country. And he was saying, now, why are you focusing on this social history? Why are you focusing on laundry workers and restaurant workers and what happened during the exclusion laws? You should be focusing on the 120 students who were given scholarships and studied in the top universities here in the 1900s. That's what he's saying. And he's saying, well, you know, the laundry workers became laundry workers because they're Cantonese and they're not intelligent. So part of why I emphasize the class questions is because each of our groups says these comparable things. And that you need those comparable people to help make these policies happen in the way that you're talking about. So I think those of us who are of Asian background, but we can apply this to every single group that's here, end up having to make a choice based on what you know and what you don't know. And unfortunately, a lot of us simply don't know, so we're really acting out of ignorance. But once you know something, we have to make a good decision. And that's something that's, I think, the key challenge, getting back to Jefferson's maxim, you know, well, the assumption is that if we know something, we'll do the right thing, but is that always true? And as Professor Runcho Yu was making, well, democracy is important. I mean, he's someone who comes from China, was in China during the Cultural Revolution. He's an American citizen now, but he has that critical perspective that the democracy voted for Chinese exclusion. It was a system working properly, and it still made the wrong decision about that. And so we know that that's a frailty of the system, not to say therefore we should get rid of it, not at all, but we have to be able to understand in a more fully embodied way that's not simply about getting a degree or having to get a Ph.D. to figure that out, but as citizens we have to be able to act and do the right thing with that knowledge, right? So that becomes a challenge, and for me that's why public history is so important. It's not about keeping it within the halls of academia. It's not about publishing a book for your own promotion. It's really about how do we do this kind of gathering. So that's especially why I appreciate Lynn and Dan supporting this kind of activity in the museum's exhibit, because that's what I think gives us a better opportunity to have these discussions. Yeah. So yes, I'm sure our time is tight, but I believe this woman here and then the man in the back. Yeah, okay, we'll get to you in a second. Yeah, thank you. But the woman right in front of you, yeah.
Hi there. So, you know, with this whole thing, you've gone over the more negative stereotyping and imagery and whatnot. What about the impact of like authors like Pearl S. Buck and others? You know, if you want to get later on in the 90s, Joy Luck Club lady. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Amy Tan, yeah.
So, how did that impact the experience? Like, you know, I know with Pearl S. Buck alone, how I was introduced to her is The Good Earth was on our bookshelf growing up from the get-go, and my grandmother was absolutely just fascinated by it. You know, she got the TCM and everything else.
Yeah.
So, was there any
benefits
to those romantic stereotypes or anything? Or
it's a great question. It's a great question because by the time Pearl Buck's novels get into film versions, they tend to kind of be a little more stereotypical, and they're always enacted. I think Loretta Young was in Yellowface in that film, and this is when blackface and yellowface were still the standards of Hollywood. So, it's tricky. It's tricky because, so Pearl Buck, was coming out of, I believe, a missionary family. And the legacy of missionaries in Asia are tricky. They're both have done really good things. My siblings were in part supported to be able to come to this country by missionaries, so my mother would be very angry. I mean, she's passed away, but she would be very angry if I said anything against missionaries. But it's a complicated story because the missionaries oftentimes are also promoting Western ideas and values and all that. So it's complicated. So Pearl Buck is complicated, but in the general scheme of things, she was a part of a group of especially women scholars and writers who actually opened up some things. And she was in part responsible for why the 1943 exclusion law got repealed. So again, I'm trying not to say that there's a romantic good or there's an evil villain, but everyone is complicated. We're all complicated, and we all need to understand and come to terms with that, and hopefully make better decisions as we make mistakes as well. Yeah. So that's a short answer. But I know this gentleman has been wanting to say something, so yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. I have a quick question, very specific, that in the last few years, we all know there is a rise of anti-Asian, anti-Chinese
hate violence. Yeah,
And oftentimes we see from the TV or from the social media that certain incidents are repeatedly reported that, especially in New York City or other places, blacks on Asian, blacks on Chinese, which I have, my own opinion about that, but I just want to ask you how to comment on that. That certainly gives people the wrong impression that, this is the way it is, but I just want to ask you for your comment.
I'm sorry, I was coughing when you kind of were stating your key observation, so could you just say what your observation is?
Okay. Well, I'm just saying, I'm just wondering that is true or not for the the perception created by those repeated images, because most of the reports are about maybe that individual is mentally challenged, but again, the media and the social media reports are quite often focused on those images, which may lead to the wrong impression that that's a black on Chinese.
Oh, black on Asian violence, you're saying. Okay, got it. Yeah, thanks. That's a really important question. It's a very delicate question, and it's a question that we have to be able to grapple with across communities. I've been part of efforts to really develop African American and Asian American solidarity, but at the same time, the reality is that there's lots of violence against lots of different people, and a lot of times people who have been in the worst possible conditions in terms of a lack of support and a lack of mental health services for lots of reasons that are, we can talk about anti-blackness, we can talk about other regions of the country where there's a lot of neglect of indigenous people, for example. So how does that affect our relationships with each other? And, in a place like New York, it's not just African Americans, but it's lots of groups that are really angry and feeling left out and feeling not supported. But, I would say that we have to reckon with, from an Asian American point of view, some of the racism that Asians hold against African Americans, and a lot of it's out of a lack of understanding of American history. And I would say the same is true for African Americans, especially those who've not had a chance to kind of be exposed to a talk or get to know a family, whether it's a restaurant family or whether they've gone to college and had a chance to learn something more. So I'm not necessarily saying you have to get a college education for this to happen. But if you're in a neighborhood, for example, there are neighborhoods like the Lower East Side where there's been a history of people getting along pretty well. But if somebody is kind of relocated or dispossessed from the housing project they're in, or the neighborhood they grew up in, and they're on the street, and there's no support for maybe the health support or the housing support they need, people get very bitter and angry. And if they feel that this group or that group is getting benefits that they've been ignored and denied, and somehow they're benefiting from the neglect that they're experiencing, then a lot of hostility is expressed. So, I think each case we need to understand what's going on. I'm really, because I am oftentimes in Maine, which is one of the, next to Vermont, one of the whitest states in the country, and the town Lewiston, in which that gunman came out of, also happens to be a very large working class community that's been deindustrialized, but also a very large Somali immigrant community. And it's interesting that at the bowling alley, I believe, there's a whole community of deaf people who are there celebrating, or there together. So I don't know what the context is, and I think we need to understand how groups are feeling displaced and angry. And I don't know if we're ever going to know about that particular person, but every single time this is happening, I think we're dealing with some fundamental questions of social psychology. That's not just about the individual, it's about the larger social, cultural, historical context that that person comes from within. And how can we create a more caring and compassionate culture? And in the case of the main shooter, his family and the people in the army who were connected to him knew this was going on, but there wasn't a sufficient cultural, social network to actually deal with that. So there's so much violence that's incipient and possibly ready to explode in so many places at the same time. I'm kind of amazed it hasn't happened more, but I worry about that, especially in this country, because there's so many guns and so many bullets and so much anger and feelings of displacement that I think many people know people who feel that way. So it's a real worrying situation, and how does this play out in terms of immigration laws or things that are being said about what should be done to another group of people, and demonization that is now at our doorstep and very much there. But my guess is that, one more person? Okay. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor. My name is Philip Tibbs, and it was an excellent presentation. I wanted to ask about what your opinion would be on 60 Minutes a couple of weeks ago. The 5 intelligence chiefs from around the world, especially the FBI person, the director, actually gave an assessment of it. They thought that the most serious intelligence theft from the People's Republic of China was in the framework to be able to do something with this. In Xi Jinping's opinion of that, if I can steal what I need to steal, I don't need to do anything to then promote anything else from what has been an industrious nation going on back to the founding of China. But from that standpoint, is also as to then what you were mentioning also is that Taiwan versus PRC, and that from now the Exclusion Act, Ping is the person that then very much understands and sees what has happened in the United States. It's a factor that would be him looking at it as, well, here's our chance to really kind of stick it to the Americans.
Well, I mean, just as a historical context, going all the way back, I have to not go too far back for the answer to this question, but there's always been this sense that the bad Asians are basically stealing things. But I just want to put the context of the nature of industrialization, for example, with the British Industrial Revolution that's happening, and how many European countries, but also the United States, were basically industrial spies. And part of what was going on is like, how can you learn how to do that machine? So this is not exclusively an Asian stealing, because Japanese have also been accused of stealing things, and there's a lot of Japan bashing. A lot of us are old enough to remember the kind of taking a sledgehammer to a Japanese-made Toyota in Detroit, as they're stealing American technology or they're taking advantage of us, et cetera, et cetera. We could say the same thing about Koreans. We could say the same thing about Taiwanese. We could say the same thing about those of us who are really old enough. We could remember things are made in Hong Kong and those are cheap copies, So this issue of copying and stealing has been deep, not just in kind of Asian American history and US Asian policies, but if we take it back to George Washington, I mean, what the founding fathers and mothers were doing is that they were making orders for porcelain sets that would have their insignia, or even George Washington's portrait that would be done by a Chinese artist on reverse glass, So reproductions and kind of this question of copying and who's copying who has been kind of deep in US history, but it's not just US history, it's really, anytime you have a competitive industrial culture, people are really stealing each other's secrets. I mean, that's the kind of dark side of how kind of building up money and building wealth and power works. And so we can talk about that. We can talk about how the Duke of York was able to have, against the Dutch who were here at New Amsterdam, how the Duke of York became the namesake for New York. I mean, a lot of land corruption was happening in the earlier period. So I just want to put that in perspective. I'm not trying to minimize actually what's happening now. I think there's probably a lot of industrial spying going on, but also other kinds of spying going on. And the United States has never been innocent of that. But for the United States to pretend that it's not involved in that, and that country is where there's a disingenuous kind of quality to that. So I just want to put that in perspective. So if we can accept that and understand the industrial spying that's going on all over the place, then we can begin to actually talk about something. Yeah. But thanks for that question. I think we're okay. Okay, there's one man who.
You want to do one more?
Do you want to say something, and then we'll end after you. So you get the last word. Whatever you're going to say, you get the last word.
I really have a question, so not a word.
Okay.
So if I understand a lot of your message tonight, it's that history is complicated. It's not simple. And yet we all have this sort of appetite for simple narratives of heroes and villains and whatnot. And I'm wondering how, I guess the other thing I'm hearing from you is that you think that maybe education is a big part of the answer to that. But I'm also a little concerned about that answer, because when you go to the polls, like your colleague was saying, when you vote for something, and you're pushing the red button or the blue button, and then you get this whole package of goods behind that button that you may be even surprised about, right? You don't really know what's coming. And so it doesn't seem like democracy, it seems like democracy wants simple answers. They don't really want complicated answers, right? And then you go back to what you're talking about, the progressive era. Progressive era and eugenics movement was led by the leading scholars and bright lights of the time, right? And so on the one hand, the educational institutions out there really didn't do well for themselves in that period of time, and probably 100 years from now, where you look back and think, yeah, at this time we're doing very well either. So if education doesn't work and democracy doesn't work, and yet there's this desire for these simple narratives, what's the answer?
Well, thanks for the question. It's tricky to end on this question, but I would say that part of the problem is, the founding fathers had a lot of wisdom, and there's a lot of really foresight that they had, and they were trying to learn from the problems with the European systems and trying to improve on that. But I have to say that part of the problem is a two-party system. Because I think when you have a two-party system, you're either villainizing one party or the other, and it's as if each party has all the answers. And that's really, so systems that don't give into that tend to have more complex solutions. Not to say that those are perfect solutions, right? And that clearly there's an advantage to countries in which there's a top-down authority if they're making decisions that are seen as for the general good, right? but also they have the power to make decisions that are for the general bad and to make lots of corruption decisions. So I don't have an easy answer. I think we're faced with a very difficult challenge right now in this country because there's a collapse in the faith of institutions in general. So I don't think it's even about one candidate or another in terms of the polls and the numbers, but I think there's a general feeling of that our institutions that we've created are not serving our interests, and that certainly the younger folks. I have a daughter who's in her 30s, and she certainly feels this way, but we know that the younger generations also feel this way, that the institutions that have been created are not serving the purposes that they are concerned about. I think that's actually true. On my campus, which is a modest-sized campus, you would think that if global warming, there's a consensus that global warming is one of the big issues that we need to be dealing with, we should have full campuses and full schools that are focused on collaborating the best research that we have across scientists, across engineers, across planners, across historians, across English majors, and our whole school should be turning in that direction and really responding to that emergency. We're not doing it. So my concern about that institution of higher education, which I've devoted a lot of my life, I'm having some real serious questions about that. But I just have to say that I think by being honest with these concerns is our only hope. I think by denying them, ignoring these questions, we're not going to do us any good. So I do think we need to be talking about these things and trying to really work on these matters, but also not to try to gain some simple consensus and therefore by voting with the faculty we're going to go in that direction. But I think we need to work in networks and clusters which can actually make some changes and begin to build in those ways, doing things that actually can make a difference. So ultimately, part of what I believe in is that we have to be pragmatic, but also we have to keep some very large ideals at the same time. Otherwise, it's going to be hard if we just follow one ideology or one party position or another. We're not going to get out of this mess. But that's not answering your question, but it's a great one to maybe leave us with, and hopefully everybody will think about it tonight and come up with part of the solution. But thank you all for really staying so